We are going to start talking while you all are eating. Please do not stop. Relax and enjoy, but we're going to jump right into content so that we do not have to cut anything short. I promise you it will be well worthwhile. We have a keynote presentation and a panel, both of which are extremely exciting. I'm looking forward to in just a few minutes. But let me start by welcoming my friend and colleague, Lori Sherwood from Maryland, who is going to present the Jane E. Lawton Award.
Thank you, Joanne. Good afternoon, everyone. I am personally honored to present the Jane E. Lawton Award today. Jane was a friend and a mentor of mine, as she was to so many of us here today. And as you know, this award is presented annually to an elected official to recognize his or her years of extraordinary service on behalf of local governments and communities throughout the United States. It was created in memory of the Honorable Jane E. Lawton, who served as mayor of Chevy Chase, delegate to the Maryland State House, and a past president of NATOA. This year's Jane E. Lawton Commemorative Award has been given to Maryland's own senior senator, Barbara Mikulski, not only for her decades of dedicated public service and tremendous leadership as chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, but also her efforts towards championing broadband in Maryland, her support of NTIA's BTOP programs and the RUS Broadband Initiative programs, her commitment to rural broadband deployment and unwavering support of public safety initiatives. And I'm also touched to be honoring Senator Mikulski, as I know that without her support and continued staff efforts over the last 3 years, the One Maryland project would not have been the success that it was. Senator Mikulski regrets that she could not be here herself today in person. As you know, there's a few things going on in Washington that need her attention right now. So she has sent a letter, and I would like to read to you a little bit of the excerpts from the letter. Greetings to the members and guests of NATOA on the occasion of your 2013 annual conference. Thank you for the kind invitation to share this exciting event with all of my good friends who promote the community interest in telecommunications. In today's global marketplace, broadband is what connects U.S. communities and businesses to each other and to the world. I was delighted when Maryland was awarded more than $115 million in competitive federal grant funds to extend broadband to rural and underserved communities across the state. Expanding broadband is crucial for increasing internet access and capacity, helping create jobs, improve public safety, increase educational opportunities, improve healthcare delivery, and infrastructure for BRAC. Thank you for the honor of the prestigious Jane E. Lawton Award. I gratefully accept this distinction. While there are many others in the room who deserve it as much or more than I do, you can be sure that no one will treasure it more than I will. I'm especially pleased because Mayor Lawton was from my great state of Maryland. Please know that I am particularly touched by receiving this award from you, the dedicated and hardworking practitioners in this exacting profession. Senator Barbara Mikulski.
And now it's my pleasure to present one of our community broadband awards. As you know, NATOA gives out a number of awards for exceptional achievements and efforts in the area of community broadband each year, and we will be presenting the majority of those awards at lunch tomorrow. But we have one special one to give today. And the 2013 NATOA Community Broadband Project of the Year goes to the North Carolina Next Generation Network. The organization with the best acronym, NC Engine. The award is given to NC Engine, which is a collaboration of 6 local jurisdictions and 4 universities, and it's given in recognition not only of pioneering efforts and extraordinarily challenging efforts to work together to bring private partners to the table to build new communications infrastructure throughout a large region of North Carolina, but also for demonstrating how community and university collaborations can enable this exploration of new models for public-private partnerships in broadband. And we are very fortunate today to have Gail Roper, the CIO of the City of Raleigh, here to accept the award.
I'm very honored to be here today, and I was asked to receive the award on behalf of the collaboration of universities and municipalities. The one thing that I can say about this initiative is that it has taught us to work together and really focus in on the business models that will change the way we provide broadband in communities, and we're learning as we go. So I thank you very much on behalf of our team. I think Dr. Hoyt, Mark Hoyt, is in the room somewhere, and he is from North Carolina State University and part of our group. So thank you very much. We're very honored.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you, North Carolina, for your wonderful representation here today, this week at the conference. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, NTIA's FirstNet board member, Ed Reynolds. Ed is a pioneer in the wireless telecommunications industry. He served as president of network operations for Singular Wireless before it was acquired by AT&T, and then as president of Bell South Mobility, which provided wireless service across 7 southeastern states. Ed's been responsible for Bell South's worldwide wireless communication strategy and the development and test marketing of new wireless features and technologies. Ed now has the incredibly important and I'm sure equally challenging job of serving as a board member of the First Responder Network Authority, known as FirstNet, which is the entity created by Congress in the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012. It's an independent authority within NTIA that is dedicated to providing emergency responders with the first high-speed nationwide broadband wireless network that will be dedicated to public safety and potentially other uses. Ed's one of 15 members on the board, represents the Southeast very ably, and is doing some incredibly important, challenging, pioneering work in this area. Please join me in welcoming Ed Reynolds.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here this afternoon to tell you a little bit about FirstNet. I've had the opportunity to speak to the Southeast Regional group of this entity and a number of other groups. And while I have a presentation, I'm going to try to fly through that as rapidly as possible because I have found that I don't learn very much when I'm speaking. I learn when you're speaking. And so I want to leave plenty of time for some Q&A at the end so I can hear what's on your mind, what questions you may have, and see if I can answer those. I'm pretty certain there's a wide variety of understanding in the room here about what FirstNet is and what our mission is and so forth. Some people may be very familiar with it, others, FirstNet what? So I'll try to, again, leave time that I can fill in some of those blanks. If I can get the right button on here, which one do I have? Nope, that's not it. There we go. Fundamental question, why FirstNet? Today, public safety has many different networks they communicate over. Principally, you can look at voice and data as the 2 main categories. For voice, there are over 20,000 separate narrowband voice networks for public safety across the country. For data, typically today, public safety relies on commercial networks, subscriptions to Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, T-Mobile, whoever else in their particular location. There are some dedicated wireless networks around for public safety for high-speed data, but very few that are interoperable outside of their local territory. The downside of the current situation is, of course, that communication barriers exist between those 20,000 voice networks. It's not uncommon at all for a particular location to have a separate radio network for voice for their fire department from their police department. And then the sheriff has a different system, and the state police have a different system, the FBI have a different system, so no one can talk to each other. If you send first responders to New Orleans to the next Hurricane Katrina, they may as well put the radio in the trunk of the car when they cross the line because it's no good in New Orleans, because New Orleans has a different proprietary type system. It's low data rates, it's strictly voice. You also have limited buying power and therefore higher prices. By using LTE, long-term evolution technology for FirstNet, we expect to reap the benefits of large volumes and therefore reduce cost. On the data side, when you use commercial networks, they're not public safety grade. Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy proved that when all of the commercial networks were down in New York City and the Jersey Shore. Throughout that entire event, New York City Police Department never lost service to a patrolman for a second. Their LMR network is rock solid, bulletproof, public safety grade. You don't have that with the commercial networks today. I used to build and operate those, so I know that they're not bulletproof. The communication shortcomings are obviously amplified during emergencies. Obviously, we're still watching the situation in Washington unfold, but if you go back to 9/11, if you go back to the Air Florida crash of the Potomac some 20 or 30 years ago, where you have multiple agencies responding and they can't talk to each other, it really points up the need for having interoperable communications across various agencies. The ability to send data and images, would that have been helpful yesterday? I don't know, but it could have been to send video images or high-resolution pictures of suspects to all of the agencies involved. I mean, how many agencies were responding to that yesterday? Metro Police, Park Police, FBI, ATF, various military units, on and on and on. It might have been helpful. Improve situational awareness, have a common operating picture for the command and control. Just enormous amount of benefit for having this type of capability. Whoops, how do I back up? There we go. There are many more reasons why public safety needs FirstNet. You need uninterrupted access during emergencies. It's during emergencies when the commercial networks that you use today for data are most stressed and therefore most likely to be overloaded if they still remain on the air. Special events bring crowds, and that brings capacity constraints onto the system. Rural emergencies pose particular challenges. In the rural areas, the commercial carriers build service where the dollars are, not where the emergency response is likely to be needed. Because they're commercial carriers, they're looking for a profitable place to build cell sites, not cover some areas where public safety may need to have coverage. Sharing a single network across the country will improve communications, and a mass market of users will certainly, we believe, help lower cost. So what is FirstNet? Talk about some of the needs for it. What exactly is it? It will be the first high-speed broadband data network dedicated to public safety. Won't be shared with commercial networks. And we're, not to be confused, the fact we're talking about in the legislation that enabled us requires us to consider partnering with existing commercial carriers because they have a lot of assets. They have towers, they have backhaul, they have a lot of different assets we might be able to leverage somehow. But if we do that, they'll be leveraged into a public safety grade FirstNet network, not a commercial network that supports public safety. We will be truly nationwide, covering all. I used to know the number of counties in the country. I think it's several thousand. I do remember there are 566 federal recognized tribes. There's another 100 or so recognized by state entities. There are 6 territories. So across the entire country, including the 6 territories, it'll be a nationwide, interoperable, seamless type network. Illustration of that, as I've used before, is if you have another emergency in, take New Orleans, I'll pick on that, I used to live there. And you bring first responders in, if you bring a firefighter in from New York City to help with recovery after a major event in New Orleans, if they have a FirstNet device and it's got a big red button on it, and they press that big red button when they're on duty in New York City, something particular happens. It may take them to the top of the queue for a dispatcher. It may alert some battalion chief. It does something unique by pressing that big red button. When they're in New Orleans responding, when they press that big red button, the same thing has to happen, the exact same thing. That's what we mean by seamless. interoperable, across the country type of network. FirstNet will be bigger, more reliable, resilient, and secure wireless network. Public safety grade. And by the way, there's no dictionary definition of public safety grade. We're trying to develop that ourselves, actually. There are various attempts at it. But what we do know is it's got to be reliable, it's got to be hardened, it's got to be redundant, and secure. So we will have standards for the FirstNet network that will absolutely be public safety grade so that you can bet your life on it, because in fact first responders do bet their life on their communication networks. We will have public safety applications. The 4G, fourth generation, or LTE technology we're using enables tons of different applications. A lot of localities have developed applications, particularly those that have access to some type of broadband, whether it's commercially provided or some proprietary system they have. They have applications galore, and they are ready to share those applications with other like departments across the country. But what's missing is a pipe to enable those applications to operate. As I've made a number of visits to different locations and talked to many first responders, I see stories all the time, medical field, about applications they have of providing, in the state of Mississippi, for example, the stroke capital of the country, by the way, the highest incidence of stroke. They have an application that they could use to transmit real-time data from a stroke patient in the Delta, which is 5 hours from Jackson, the main trauma center, and determine where to take that patient or how to treat that patient, and have a tremendous tremendous impact on survivability first, and then post-survivability on the quality of life following that, if they treat that patient properly by transmitting the right data to the right physicians that are trained in that particular field. So, and I saw the same thing in New Jersey, lots of different places, applications just crying out for a broadband pipe. And this will definitely be a force multiplier for all aspects of public safety. We are, as was pointed out, an independent authority within NTIA. We're occasionally try to find out exactly how independent that is, and it's not totally independent. And some of us, there are 6 board members who come from the commercial world like myself, who are accustomed to building and operating large wireless networks, or in one case, satellite networks. And it can be frustrating at times because we tend to have a bias for action, and sometimes we encounter a bias for inaction. But we're working our way through that. We're learning, and hopefully, on the other hand, we're teaching and trying to get some of that bureaucracy out of the way so we can get the job done and provide the network to first responders that they need. We've been allocated some prime real estate. We have 20 megahertz of spectrum in the 700 megahertz band. For those of you who are radio savvy, the lower the frequency band, the better the propagation, the more reach, the more coverage you get from a single cell site. Cellular, by comparison, is 850 megahertz, so 700 is better. PCS, like Sprint uses, is 2 gigahertz, so it doesn't go very far at all. So this is prime real estate. We have $7 billion. $2 billion is available to us today. The other $5 billion comes in the auctions, the next round of auctions of former TV spectrum. We are keeping our fingers crossed that happens. It happens on time and raises at least $5 billion. We are doing contingency planning to see what we could do with $2 billion or what we could do with less. That's why we have to partner with other folks, and those partnerships extend to a lot of people in this room. Having a conversation earlier about the amount of fiber that you all have in your localities. Tremendous opportunity for us to leverage those assets and help serve you and your communities while utilizing an asset you have and providing you something in return. So lots of opportunities we're going to have to explore, because for $7 billion, it's debatable whether you could build a nationwide network from scratch for that. My personal belief is that you could build it, in fact, for that, probably $3 to $4 billion, maybe a little more, but you can't operate it. You can't operate it till you reach break even, because your site rental cost and your backhaul cost would be $1.5 billion to $2 billion a year. So, so you can build it, but you can't operate it on a self-sustaining basis. So we have to find ways to partner and leverage assets, and the legislation that created us specifically admonishes us to do just that. We do have to be sustainable long-term, which will be through user fees, and you will be interested in those because you'll be making the decisions to adopt the FirstNet service. So how will we impact public safety? First, we'll provide fast access to applications that can be shared broadly or on a limited credential basis. Some apps need to be kept at a more secure level than others. Some could be opened up to everyone. Streaming video, surveillance, large file transfers, license plate readers. Some of this stuff is not popular these days, but it's useful to law enforcement, and I like it. Field fingerprinting, field reporting, etc. So a lot of things you can do with a broadband network that you just cannot do with a local mobile radio network, narrowband, and that you can't do reliably with a commercial data network. We talk about local mobile radio, those networks, the push-to-talk networks that police and fire and EMTs use today. Public safety is going to rely on those networks for a long time to come because for mission-critical voice, we cannot replace those with LTE today. First, voice over LTE, or called VoLTE, is not yet in commercial service to any large degree. In this country, only one carrier, and that's Metro PCS, I believe, has deployed VoLTE. It's voice over packet data, and it's got a lot of kinks to be worked out before it would become really commercial grade, much less public safety grade. There are other key elements that we need. Push to talk. We don't have a reliable push to talk solution. That's working its way through the standards process. One thing we're committed to doing is maintaining this network as a standard network. None of this proprietary stuff where you got to pay a license fee and all that. Everything we do is going to be worked through the standards bodies nationally and internationally. So there's a push-to-talk effort underway, direct mode or talk around, whatever you want to call it. In other words, it's mobile-to-mobile communication in absence of any infrastructure. Public safety has to have that before we can consider using our network for mission-critical voice. Enhanced broadcast, one-to-many type broadcast, a high-powered mobile. Instead of the 4 to 6/10 of a watt mobile that is common in commercial terms, we need probably a 2 or 5 or maybe 10 watt device, vehicle mounted, particularly for rural applications. That also is currently working itself through the standards process. And as I've mentioned before, public safety grade. Device-wise, there'll be an abundance of different devices, everything from a basic smartphone, just like you can buy today commercially, except it will have band 14 in it, the FirstNet band, all the way up to hardened handset devices, laptops, modems in squad cars and fire engines, et cetera, et cetera. In time, FirstNet and its service and applications will basically transform the way public safety does its job. If you can imagine the days before two-way radio. That's why Bonnie and Clyde were so successful, right? Because as long as they outran the cops in the little town, they couldn't call ahead, radio ahead and say, set up a roadblock. So the two-way radio changed public safety forever. Broadband data access, ubiquitously around the country, seamless, interoperable, will clearly change the way we do business in public safety in the future. So what are our plans for creating FirstNet? There are several fundamental pillars. First is we have put out a number of BTOP grants. NTIA did about 3 or almost 4 years ago now, preceding the creation of FirstNet. There were 30-some BTOP grants, and some of you probably have received some of those grants. 7 of those 30-some odd were focused on public safety. And we have been visiting with them and working with them to try to find out if, first of all, if the projects they were embarked on would be useful to FirstNet, that it would give us some learnings we could profit from, and also we could fold it into FirstNet as we build the network. We determined that all 7 actually could do so, and we've been in negotiations with all 7 entities trying to find a workable spectrum lease to provide our spectrum to those BTOP entities with the conditions, obviously, that they folded into FirstNet at the right time and so forth. We are going to be successful, it looks like, in about 4 out of the 7. And 3 of them we've stopped discussions with. I think we've signed 3 of the other 4, and the other one is imminent to be signed. So we're going to continue to work those and learn from that as we begin to look at the nationwide plans. We also have some mandates. We're mandated to do state outreach. We're mandated to provide state-based network plans. We will have a core network. The way LTE works is a core packet network that connects everything together and ties you to the servers and applications and to the internet and so forth. And then the radio access network are the towers and the backhaul out in the geography. So we will have a FirstNet operated core. We will have individual state radio networks, and there is a decision point that each state will make as to whether they want FirstNet to execute its plan that we'll present to them and build and operate it, or the state has an opportunity to build their own if they choose to, although I don't know why a state would, but they may. Network partners, I mentioned that a bit earlier. We're looking at existing wireless carriers, commercial carriers. We're looking at existing public safety assets, existing government assets, partnering with anybody we can that can fold into and support the mission of a public safety grade, reliable broadband network. Portable hotspots. In some areas, it's just not going to work out to build a terrestrial-based network. We plan to use satellites, by the way, to cover some areas, but in Alaska, we found out that satellites don't get up there very well because that's sort of way up toward the North Pole. They also have pretty high mountains, and so the satellites that do reach in there are blocked by the mountains. And so there are areas there, there's rural areas probably in the great Midwest, Dakotas and so forth, that we may not be able to effectively put permanent facilities, but we could have deployables, cell on wheels, a system on wheels. It could be on a public safety vehicle, a fire engine or some type of special police vehicle or something to go out if they have an emergency, and it becomes the cell site, the system to serve that area. And then wireless devices, the other part of the equation. And all of that is supported by the foundation of the FirstNet organization. Just a word on the decision process. We will develop a nationwide plan for the 50 states and 6 territories. The core plan is one, and then the individual radio network plans, coverage, where the cell sites go, what the backhaul is, what the power backup is, all those kind of things. And we will go present that to each of the 56 governors, if you will. So this is our plan for covering the state of Florida. It's our plan for covering the state of New York. The governor then, by statute, has 90 days to determine whether their state will accept that plan, we'll build it and operate it, we're fine, or they can opt out and choose to build their own. If they do opt out, they have 180 days to come up with their own plan. And by the way, all these plans, the one we present initially has to be through RFP, so vendors have been selected but not awarded yet. The state plan would have to be the same way. Vendors selected but not awarded, take that to the FCC. The FCC then opines as to whether that plan is sufficient to support the FirstNet mission. If it is, the state goes ahead and builds their plan. If it's not, we fall back to the FirstNet plan and we build and operate it. Now, that's the key decision at the state level. And I've had questions, well, can a city opt in or out? No, it's a state-by-state decision about building and operating the network. However, local control, local management, determining what units are activated on the network, deactivated, what their priority access level is, both initially and dynamically, because you can change that over time. You may need to up the priority level from 2 to 14 for a particular device because that particular officer is on scene of a disaster that you need streaming video. So you can change the dynamic. All of those functions are controlled by the local entity, the local police department, the local sheriff's office, the local fire department. The decisions you will likely be involved in are not the one about the network, but it's the adoption decision. Does it make sense for you to use a FirstNet device as part of your communication strategy for broadband data for your first responders? It means it has to be public safety grade, has to provide you with everything you need, and has to be priced effectively. In fact, what we've taken on as a planning mechanism is that unlike some companies that decide, particularly government entities, decide what it's going to cost to build and provide this and divide the cost by the users, and that's what we charge you. We take it from the other end of the telescope. What are you paying today? And it's typically $35 to $40 for a commercial subscription for a smartphone, a wireless broadband LTE subscription. So we got to start there. Now, we might be $5 or $10 more valuable because it's dedicated to public safety. It's reliable, redundant, hardened. It's not going to fail, as the commercial networks do all the time. So there might be some small premium there, but it's not $100. It might be just picking up 5 or 10. So it has to be something that's cost effective and also useful in your particular jurisdiction. So what can you do? Stay informed, which is part of what we're trying to do today. We do have a website. It'll be enhanced later. You can give input to your state point of contact. Each governor has or will appoint a single point of contact to help in this decision making when we present our network plan. Share your ideas for applications and services with Peace Act members. There's a 42-member public safety advisory committee that's advising us, taking all this input in. Watch for the launch of our new website and spread the word about FirstNet. And I'll add another one, and that is somehow through RFI process or through contacting us, the board, or our general manager, or through the website, is let us know what assets you may have that you think could fold into FirstNet. Because, you know, I'm finding there's a lot more fiber and a lot more backhaul, a lot more of every asset we're going to need out there than I ever imagined there would be. We just need to be sure we identify all of them, and if they can fit the public safety requirement of reliability, redundancy, et cetera, then adopt those. And finally, FirstNet will create a network for millions of public safety users who need to be able to send data and talk to one another to meet their mission. Clear and simple. I'll be glad to take your questions. Look forward to them.
And we have time for a couple. We do have time for a couple questions. If you have one, please stand up and I'll work my way over to you. I don't think they're working. I can control things this way, folks.
I just had a question. I mean, you touched on the interaction with the states, and I think you were pretty clear on that. But like in Oregon, for example, they had the Owen project. Now I think it's called the Oregon State Radio Project or something like that. That's already been underway for several years, and they're already doing improvements and building new tower sites, et cetera. So when this comes along, how's that going to affect a state that's already made decisions on a statewide radio network?
What type of network is that? Is it basically a statewide LMR network? Okay, I'm not familiar with Oregon. I am familiar with Mississippi. I'm from Alabama, so they send me to all the southern states because I talk the language. And also, when I was talking about the stroke capital and obesity and all that kind of stuff, Alabama used to say, thank God for Mississippi, it would be last. But I do know about Mississippi, and they are just finishing up or have just finished up deploying a statewide LMR network, local mobile radio, push-to-talk, two-way voice, voice only, narrow band. And it's sort of, to me, a voice microcosm of FirstNet. Their governor, Barber, years ago, ironically the same year that Hurricane Katrina and Rita hit, but it was not associated with that. He actually had the law passed in the spring of that year to establish a statewide board called the Wireless Communications Commission. And they determined that they're such a rural state and there's so many small entities, everything from a little, 5 or 10 member volunteer fire department somewhere to a sheriff's office that's got 3 deputies to whatever. And those folks had a hard time maintaining any type of communication vehicle for just basic voice. And so the state stepped in and said, why don't we build a statewide network for LMR? It's not broadband data, it's just voice. And they did that in 3 phases. The southern sort of strip of the state covered the Gulf Coast, hurricanes, the middle, and then the north. And they just finished up the northern tier. I think it is completed in service. Now, I know the first 2 are. And so if that's what Oregon's doing, it'll be, FirstNet will supplement that with the data component. And then eventually, years down the road, when we have all those things we need on FirstNet to have mission-critical voice, it might displace it, but not for a number of years. So I don't think that's a wasted investment.
One of the lessons that we learned with the BTOP program was, before you build, find out what assets are out there. But no matter how many times or how many ways you ask, not everyone who has assets is going to respond. So as the individual local governments that are represented here, and your advice is great, start identifying your assets. And I think they need to work with the individual point of contact in each state to do that. But is there any funding through NTIA or through FirstNet that will help states and local governments
Glad you asked that
really
question because I think I know the answer.
Yeah.
I think the funding that's available for that are through the SLIGP grants, the State and Local Implementation Grant Program. It's not run by FirstNet. It's run by NTIA, by Commerce. But this was a program specifically set up. They have $130-some million, I think. They've made one set of grants. The second set has either been made or is about to be made. And the purpose of those is, I believe, to exactly address your concern. We're going to be asking, besides things like RFIs and all that, we're going to be asking each state through the single point of contact, help us fill in these blanks. You know, what type of assets do you have with regards to towers and backhaul and this, that, and the other. And in order for the state to effectively respond, they need some funding. And the SLIP grants are designed to do that. It'll be a few $1 million for each state. It varies. There's some formula that NTA worked out, depends on the size of the state, not so much population, but geography, I think. But I think that's exactly intended to meet your need. And we're also going to be very careful to only ask questions we really need to have answered, and not just say, tell us all about what you got out there. Now, we want to be very specific so that you don't go off and send us a whole bunch of data and we say, well, that was interesting, you know, and toss it over here. That doesn't help anybody. So, but it's a good question.
I'm lucky. This is the second time I've gotten to hear you. You were speaking.
And you call that lucky. Thank you.
I do, because I want to thank you. I don't think that the level of candor that you have spoke to us both here and in Charlotte at the SATOA has just been wonderful. It was an interesting hiccup, or to me it appeared to be a hiccup in the news the other week, where former FCC Commissioner Jonathan Adelstein, who is now the head of the association that represents the tower owners, said that he thought that there was discussion about FirstNet wanting to have a securitized interest in the towers, and therefore thought that there would be less participation by private enterprise. And I was wondering if that characterization is accurate as far as you're concerned, and two, how would FirstNet require a securitized interest in a public asset, whether it be a public building rooftop or a publicly owned tower?
I did not hear his comments, but I think I know where he's coming from. The federal government, and this may be the law in some of your states or other government entities, but the federal government cannot spend money to improve an asset in which it does not have an ownership. And so the question, I think, revolves around if we have to beef up a tower to meet public safety requirements. Let's say we're going to use whatever that Rev something is, Rev G, you know, the thing about 160 mile an hour wind and ice and all that. If we decide that's part of the public safety standard and we're going to use a tower that American or Crown or somebody owns that doesn't meet that, we can't go take our own money and spend $30,000, $40,000 to beef that tower up without having an interest in it. And we know the tower owner is not going to want to provide us a security interest. So the way around it is to somehow work something out with that tower owner for them to do the improvements and put it into the rent. And you avoid, you know, us spending money directly. I think that's what the genesis of that question is. And so I think that's the answer to it. But, you know, the tower companies want to work with us, I think, and we want to work with them, but it's going to have to be something that obviously that's one of those government rules that, you know, if I were a commercial operator, I wouldn't have that issue, but I have it. Thanks for the question.
Hi, Catherine Rice, the SATOA president. I know there's a provision in the Middle Class Tax Relief Act that requires substantial rural presence, and there are a lot of rural areas in our country that have no broadband or basically none. Is there any opportunity while you build out this network for it to be used outside of just public safety for other uses, for broadband, residential broadband, or what have you?
I think there is on a couple of different levels. One is whatever backhaul we establish or utilize might support a broadband commercial installation out there. As I said, there's a lot of assets out there today. There's a lot of potential assets. The state of Nebraska, I didn't know this, the power grid is owned by the state of Nebraska, their entire statewide power grid. They have tons of fiber and they would like to have some more. Their transmission towers are tall enough to be cell sites. So we might be able to utilize that, and by using their fiber, that might give us an opportunity to have our service, and it might also provide backhaul for some other operator. a whole different approach is to actually use our 700 meg spectrum for broadband. We could go to a rural carrier in North Dakota, and they probably in much of those type states, the only services that are built are the 2 cellular licenses, the 2 850 licenses. They had to be built or they would lose the license. And to build 1,900, PCS just is prohibitively expensive. You have to have a cell site every 4 or 5 miles, and it just doesn't work. So we could go to one of those rural carriers, and they have their 850 network. They don't have within their 25 meg of 850 spectrum the capability of launching any type of broadband wireless because they're already filled up with their data. Their voice service. We could say, look, here's this 700 meg spectrum, good propagation characteristics. Would you like to partner with us, utilize your towers, which in their case, many of their towers are pretty hardened because they have to be hardened for winds and snow and ice and all that. And they have good backhaul because they know that if they lose one tower, they lose a huge hole out of their coverage. So they probably have redundant, whether it's microwave or fiber feed or something. We said, look, there's a way we can partner with you, and you can use the spectrum when we're not using it. Because the fact is, even in New York City or Los Angeles or any major metro, most of the time, public safety needs about that much of this much spectrum. And so we will work with the larger carriers or any carrier in a city to do about the same type of sharing. When we're not using it, you can use it, but the minute we need it, we take the whole 20, what we call ruthless preemption. I like that term. In a rural environment, we do the same thing. The difference is that if we had to take all 20, you have a disaster occur outside of Minot or something, and so we have to take the whole 20 meg. They don't have any place else to go. Whereas in New York City, Verizon has other LTE carriers that they can put the traffic onto. From a user perspective, their session remains up. They didn't drop their internet session. They just got slower throughput, some latency, and so forth. In a rural area, that's the downside, is it might go away. On the other hand, how long would it take to get enough first responders concentrated in somewhere in rural North Dakota to take up 20 mega spectrum? Probably a lot longer time than you can imagine. So I think as a practical matter, it may work. And that would be a way of not only sharing whatever backhaul there, but also our radio spectrum. And I come from sort of a rural background myself. One of the things I was proudest of in my wireless career was launching launched the first rural service area in the United States down in Morgan City, Louisiana. When I came into Bell South Wireless in '89, nobody's interested in wireless. They figured, this is back to that McKinsey study in 1984, said only over a million customers in the country and only in the top 30 or 40 cities. Well, I figured out rural country people wanted to talk too. And so I encouraged Bell South to get some licenses, so we did. And I had all these rural licenses, and I kept outgrowing the Atlantas and the South Floridas because the demand was there. And so I have a special sensitivity to serving the rural areas. And I think the partnerships with carriers, and it could be some of the large guys that have rural spectrum, but it could be C Spire, it could be, Poco Lambro Wireless, and it could be any small carrier might work with us like that. So, yeah, good question. I hope we'll have a good answer for it.
And unfortunately, folks, we are out of time. But if you'll join me in thanking Mr. Reynolds for coming down here and speaking with us today. And for those of you that are interested in FirstNet issues, I just want to remind you that NATOA does talk about FirstNet quite often in our eNATOA series, along with joint webinars with the National League of Cities and the National Association of Counties. So keep an eye out for those seminars. Also, please, if you want to hear more about this and discuss these issues, please join NATOA's public safety listserv and its committee. Meetings are every month, and they're still going to be chaired by NATOA member Barry Frazier, so please take advantage of those services.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. We're going to go right into our panel discussion, so let me invite the panelists to come up. And I'm going to get started and wait for my microphone to come to me, if that's okay. Keep eating, or if you haven't discovered the chocolates on the table in front of you, discover them now. I know there's coffee circulating as well, so give us just a minute to get organized and we'll get started.
There's two ways of saying it. The way Microsoft says it is principal technology policy strategist, which I interpret as principal strategist, comma, technology policy, which I think is sort of a little clearer.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, now you're on.
I don't think so. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you for your patience. We're going to launch right in because we've got some really, really interesting conversation to have this afternoon. Thank you. I have lots of pleasures this week. Among them is the great pleasure of introducing the panelists that I have up here today. All three of these people, in various capacities, have been great friends to local government communications, strategies, and policies and choices. And we are very interested to hear their perspectives and on behalf of their organizations. Let me start to my right. Derek Slater is policy manager of the Google Fiber team, which has been an organization that has been very supportive of this association, and we're grateful. I'll let him tell you a bit more about himself. I will just say that I have thought over the years frequently that Derek was, tell me, I may have this wrong, but I always thought that Derek's job was to sort of sit around and think really big thoughts about the future of the internet and then write about them. And there have been a couple occasions where I've envied that job. Our first speaker. To Derek's right is Sharon Gillette, who is Principal Technology Policy Strategist for Microsoft. And Sharon is a very familiar face around NTOA. I think her first NTOA conference was maybe 2002? 2002, when she was researching the impact of broadband in communities around the country as a researcher at MIT. And since then has been a state regulator and then was chief of the Wireline Competition Bureau at the FCC, where she was a great friend to local government and to many of the things that we champion. And to Sharon's right is Angie Cronenberg. And Angie is chief advocate and general counsel at CompTel. I'll let her tell you more about CompTel and its position. So I'll say that Angie, who until recently was a senior advisor to Commissioner Clyburn at the FCC, has also been one of the great friends in Washington to local government. We're grateful to all three of you for being here. So let me start by asking you each to take a couple minutes just to talk a little bit about the entity that you represent, and then also our topic today is the role of technology and broadband, the internet in particular, in our economy and in the future of our economy. It's a very wide-ranging role, so let me invite you to share whatever your thoughts are in that regard for a couple minutes, then I'll ask some questions, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. Angie, will you go first?
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I had the opportunity to work with Joanne and Steve and Ken. Can you hear me?
No.
It is on. Let me just check. Now, can you hear me? There we go. A little bit louder.
You might have to move the lab up.
I will try to project my voice as well.
Your necklace.
I don't know if I'm allowed to touch this. There we go. Is that better? Can you all hear me now? It's still not. Yeah. Maybe if I hold it, that might be more useful. Okay, how's that? Now you can hear me? Great. Might as well just use a handheld mic, right? So I had the opportunity while I was in Commissioner Clyburn's office to work closely with Joanne and Steve and Ken on NTOA's issues, and in particular, the ability for local communities to address their broadband needs, and really working to make sure that state legislatures were fully informed about the choices that they had before them in legislation about restrictions on muni broadband. And so it was always a pleasure to work with them and to see them come in and talk to me about the other issues that were pending at the FCC. And in my new capacity at CompTel, I'm looking forward to continuing that tradition and that relationship. And so I look forward to engaging in today, but also engaging in the future with you all. So CompTel is the leading trade association that has as its members many competitive telecommunications and broadband providers. We also have relationships with manufacturers, and some of those are also members of CompTel. And our role at in Washington at the FCC and on the Hill is to educate the policymakers about the importance of competitive marketplace, and ensuring that there's a level playing field and that competitive carriers have the capability to actually offer alternative services in their local communities. And there are many competitive providers throughout the nation, some of whom are probably in your communities, that are working every single day to ensure that consumers, mainly in the enterprise market, but also some in the residential market, have choice. And what does choice do? Choice really allows for innovation to happen. It typically allows for lower prices to happen. So I've been thrilled that I've been able to transition from my role at the FCC and working with Commissioner Clyburn so much on the competitive issues and back into the private sector and helping ComTel really get its message to policymakers and to work directly with other associations and other industry organizations to ensure that the policy that's coming out of Washington reflects a policy that's going to be good for consumers and good for all your communities.
Sharon?
Thanks, Joanne. Thanks. It's good to be back at NATOA. It's okay? All right. I tell you a little bit, just a little bit about myself. I started my my professional life working on the ARPANET, which was the predecessor to the one of the predecessors to the internet, and kind of got the bug of like, this is great stuff and everybody should have access to it, and kind of spent the next 20 or some odd years trying to make that happen in a variety of capacities. One of which was researching how local governments, what their role was, and how they were spreading the internet. Joanne, that's why I was here in 2002 to talk about that. And then, you know, as a state regulator, and also for a brief 2 months working as head of the Mass Broadband Institute, which is the entity that was at the time applying for BTOP funds, which I did, you know, because we needed someone to apply for it before we had a permanent director. But I then moved down to the FCC, where a big piece of my job was reorienting the Universal Service Fund to support broadband, and Angie was a big partner in that. Now that I'm at Microsoft, our technology policy group, we're part of advanced strategy and research in Microsoft. So we look a little further out than the day-to-day, and we look at where technology is headed, and we look at where policy is headed, and we try to see where the intersections are and what the implications are of each for the other. My focus in that group is really what we call connectivity strategy, or in other words, communications networks. And I'm looking at, you know, particularly things like as the phone networks transition to IP, and as media networks, and cable and broadcasting and so forth, transition to IP, what does that mean for a company that sees itself as selling devices and services in the future? Those devices and services all have to be connected to work. Microsoft doesn't sell that connectivity, and so, you know, what does that mean for the company? So that's a big piece of what I'm thinking about. I haven't lost my passion for Catherine for the fact that everybody needs to be connected. And I'm also very, and one of the things that the group that I work with has been very involved in over the past decade, along with Microsoft Research, which developed a lot of the technologies to do this, is the use of TV spectrum, unused TV spectrum, called white spaces, for rural broadband access. And that's something that we've done quite a bit on. We have projects all around the world, ranging from Africa to England to various rural places in the United States. There's a lot of really interesting work going on in that. One of the first things that occurred to me, I guess about 6 months or so ago, was there's all these middle mile networks about to come online that a lot of you are involved in, right? Funded by the NTIA, the BTOP networks, right? Boy, that's going to create a lot of pressure for people to hang things off of those networks and create last mile networks. And gee, maybe white spaces is a good way to do that in some cases. So I think we're starting to see that. One thing I would just thought I would just leave you with is that I'm not sure that folks at the FCC always know that that's actually happening. It's something you're thinking about. And if it is, it's something that a letter here or there to the FCC would probably be a very useful use of 5 minutes, just to make sure that people know that you're thinking about this and this is something that matters to your communities.
Okay. Derek?
Sure. So thanks again, Joanne, for having me here. I'm Derek Slater. I work on Google's Central Public Policy team out of Mountain View. Now, why do we have a public policy team in Mountain View? Well, we have government relations teams in DC and London and Brussels and so on. The group that I work in is sort of the glue that connects the product teams like Google Fiber to the rest of the team around the world, but also creates the sort of central infrastructure, including the research that helps our team around the world think about, well, how do we think about the key innovation and technology policy issues of the day? One of the key things that we've spent our time researching, and it's key to our advocacy, is how do we think about the internet's contribution to the economy and society? How do you measure that? Now, I think for everyone in this room, it's pretty clear that the internet has a huge impact, but how big is it and how do we think about it? And the challenge that we've been looking at is how do you measure the 21st century economy and how do you get beyond sort of traditional metrics? What do I mean by that? If you look at the internet through traditional metrics like GDP, obviously it's a huge part of economies around the world and growing. So I think McKinsey Global Institute said it's about 3.4% of the economy in sort of major economies, rapidly growing in developing economies. And that's helping across not just the technology sector, not just the internet sector, but across traditional companies as well. But those sort of traditional metrics miss part of the point. Let me give you a concrete example. Think about Wikipedia. What's its direct contribution to GDP? Well, zero, right? They have no revenue, they have no ad model, they're not selling subscriptions. But obviously, you get a lot of benefit from it every day. And in fact, the benefit is hard to measure because it's sort of decentralized and distributed. You might go up and look up a particular fact that before you'd have to go to the library or call somebody up to find. Now you get it much quicker. Measuring each of those individual instances, tough to get the gains. But if you add all those up against millions and millions of users, millions and millions of searches, you get a pretty big number. That you can play that out across basically all the sorts of free services you use online, whether that's Google or map services and so on. And once you do that, you start to see, wow, the impact of the internet is actually something we can't quite get our arms around yet. There have been attempts to do this looking at consumer surplus, so looking at those free services and trying to calculate the tens of billions of dollars in value that consumers get from them that's sort of above and beyond what they would be, what they have to pay for it. You can also look at time saved, right? You don't have to make that drive down to the library. You don't have to go look certain information up in a book or find the right book. You can just go online and get it. That has tens of billions of dollars in positive impact. But it's still sort of early stages in I think, the study of what are the 21st century metrics for the 21st century economy? How does that tie back to broadband? Well, as we look at Google Fiber, and sort of upgrades to ultra-fast networks, we're starting to see the economic impacts in small but definable ways. So Kansas City had its bond rating upgraded by Fitch. We're seeing startups form the startup village in Kansas City as Google Fiber's been coming to town. But if you think further ahead, measuring the impacts and sort of what will ultra-fast broadband mean to the economy, that's something much harder. I think Sharon and others have done work sort of on broadband in the sort of the generation we have today and its economic contributions. But in terms of thinking about the vast changes that moving from today's broadband speeds to ultra-fast to gigabit speeds where it will change education and healthcare and so on, that's something where I think we need different measurement paradigms than we have today, and that's one of the challenges we're focusing on.
Sharon, picking up on the point Derek just made, you did one of the first and still one of the most significant studies on the economic impact of broadband, and that was early generation broadband. Could you sort of share with us some of your thinking about what might have changed from the data you were seeing then? And that, by the way, we would not call broadband anymore. What was then defined as broadband, in fact, we shouldn't have been calling it broadband then. I think it was 200 kilobits in one direction was the FCC definition at the time, and it's 10, 12 years ago. Can you talk a little bit about your research and how you think these things have evolved?
Sure, that's a big topic. Yeah, the study I did it with several colleagues. Bill Lehrer was the economist and a student named Carlos Osorio. And the study was in 2006, and I can tell you every flaw in it. Many people said to me, that was a really bad study. I was like, yeah, I know. Because we were working with the data that was available at the time, and at the time the FCC, the way they decided whether broadband was available somewhere is if anyone mailed a bill to anyone in the zip code, which all it told you was that someone mailed a bill to someone in the zip code. It didn't really mean that people had broadband available. And not only that, it didn't tell you whether they actually used it, right? So if one person in the zip code subscribed, that got counted as a, that's lit, right? So we really, you want to look at what are people doing with it. So that's one thing that I think is very different. You have to look at that. The second thing was after we did that study, despite that, we found a positive impact of broadband on economic, on growth of businesses and so on. I think there were two really things that are different. I think you can look at usage now; it's just much more instrumented than it was. The second is we now have more variety in the marketplace, if you will, of speed, different qualities of broadband and so forth. One of the big follow-on questions people kept asking us after that study is, could you tell us how much fiber if that's what broadband does, where broadband's defined as 200 kilobits, what would fiber do? And it's very difficult to do that, because if there's nothing different about what people do with fiber than what they do with 200 kilobits, you can give them fiber, but it doesn't change. It's not going to change the economic impact. You have to have the whole ecosystem to go along with it. And I know you see this in places like Chattanooga, or I'm sure in Kansas City. You see when people get fiber, then the apps start coming, then the startups start coming, and it becomes a cycle of innovation. And that's when you start to see the impact. So some time has to go on, and we couldn't turn around in 2007 and do that, but I'm sure it's possible today, and especially if you instrument things. You get better social science results if you actually do experiments than if you look back in time at flawed metrics. So I think we have much more potential to do those studies in different ways today. That helps.
So Angie, let me ask you, because I know you said most of your members are serving the business markets, like the institutional enterprise markets. This is an audience among whom many people spend a lot of their time thinking about how to expand broadband to their businesses as well as their residents. And many of them have been instrumental in making sure that the cable broadband platform has gotten out widely within their communities. Can you tell us a bit about CompTel's thinking and any research that CompTel might have done about the economic impact of your infrastructure?
Yeah, so I think it's apparent that whenever you have multiple facilities-based providers, right, that there's more opportunity for consumers to then choose based on a variety of factors. Some of that may be price, some of it may be the managed services that are being offered, and all of that is good for the consumer itself, but then also good in terms of the innovation that can happen within a business place. I was looking back at some numbers which are a little old at this point because it was 2010 data, but according to the Small Business Administration, for those small businesses that were using computers, 95% of them were connected to the internet. And those connections to the internet have been really important in a variety of ways for those businesses. Not only can they reach new customers through the internet and conduct their business in a new way, many of them are now using social media to draw customers, reaching out to customers in different geographic areas, and tying all of that back to, how much are they spending to have those kinds of connections, and also connections that they're using for data. And what the SBA data shows is that they're spending up to $3,300 a month on those kinds of connections. And for a small business, that is a lot of money. So where you can provide the kind of competition that will help drive the pricing down, then that's money that the small businesses can use to invest back into their products and their services, your communities. They can hire more people. So it's, in some ways, you do kind of have to look at this, as Sharon was suggesting, on a local basis, like what's happening here and now, and you can't just look at it nationwide. You really have to look at the local geographic area and what it means. Another interesting data point that I've seen recently is that 60% of the buildings where enterprises operate are still only connected via copper. And that's buildings with 20 or more employees, so not businesses, but employees there. So when you think about it in those terms, that's still a lot of buildings that don't have fiber. So what's available via copper? And we have many providers that are offering Ethernet over copper, so you can get up to 100 megs right now with Ethernet over copper. So it's a fairly good substitute, right? But as more data, as more communications is moving over these higher speeds, then you can see why we need to be thinking about how can we connect more buildings, how can we connect more residences using higher speed capacity data networks. And it is important to be thinking about how your particular projects that you're working on, can you get more bang for the buck for your community, because you're not just thinking about the local community anchor institutions, you're also thinking about, can you sell pieces of this to competitive providers, to the incumbents, who can then use it to compete with one another for the ultimate business of your residents and your enterprise market, and to really create a very healthy ecosystem. And then I have to mention, because one of the things I was thinking about as Sharon was responding to your last question, and the healthy ecosystem, all of that is really dependent on an open internet. And that is a big issue that is pending in the DC circuit right now, about exactly whether or not the steps that the commission took at the end of 2010 that were very high-level rules of the road to protect an open internet so that there is lots of innovation, whether or not that's going to continue. And that's, I sat through the oral arguments, and everyone always pauses, like, you never can tell from oral arguments exactly how the court's going to come down, and that's absolutely true. But I walked out of the courtroom a little worried, a little happy that they seem to be okay with the FCC's broadband authority, but a little worried about where we are going to be on the actual principles that we, implemented into rules for the open internet. So I think everyone here needs to be looking at that and thinking about it, and not forget that those principles are really what has led to the innovations we've seen to date.
And for anyone in the room who's not familiar with the term open internet or that proceeding, that litigation that's currently in the DC circuit, that's the issue sometimes known as net neutrality, which has to do with whether discrimination is allowable over these platforms. Thank you for that. And let me actually invite you guys also to feel free to chime in on open internet, because I'd love to hear what you have to say. But I also, while we're jump in on any of these, but Derek, I'd also like to ask you, while we're talking about the economic impact issues, I know it's early days yet in Kansas City, and I know also that Google doesn't share everything publicly, and we understand where you're coming from on that. Is there anything you can tell us about the kind of research on economic impact that you guys may be doing or planning to do in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's early days now, and I'm frankly trying to figure it out. We've started to see, as I said, this sort of the anecdotal evidence of the positive impact, the increase of the bond rating, the startup village beginning, and certainly gratified by seeing people happy as the product gets installed. But in terms of the wider spread, research, rigorous research, to Sharon's point, we're trying to think about, well, how do we both do sort of experiments? How do you look at, do A/B testing sort of between different scenarios, as well as how do we start instrumenting now for the sort of 10 years? And even though it's a long way off, doesn't affect the policy issues today, it's sort of the important groundwork that we have to lay now. So early days, but that's sort of where we're heading. The other piece that I think that we have done some more work on is speed and quality measurement of connections. One of the projects we've supported for a long time is called Measurement Lab, which is a collaboration of research institutions, academics, think tanks, and companies that have built an open platform for broadband measurement, where users can go to a website, run a tool, learn about their connection, but also where researchers can come and deploy new sorts of tools. So you're not just measuring speed, but sort of new factors. I think that's going to become more and more important, because I think more and more people are sort of getting speed, but speed or speed test might not actually capture their quality of experience, which might be limited by a whole bunch of other factors. So you might have a speed on the network that is something, but your quality of experience to YouTube or Netflix might be limited by interconnection or other factors. And that's something that we're looking very hard at. How do you study that?
Net neutrality?
Net neutrality, but also just to pick up on his point, the speed test. Those are if any of you read the Measuring Broadband America reports that the FCC puts out, that was the first attempt to say, okay, what speeds do people actually get, and that's based on the MLab technology, as well as some other things mixed in with it. But really, first attempt, and what do people actually get? Up to, but what are people actually getting? To go back to your open internet point, it's crucially important. I mean, I think BTOP. Any of you run BTOP or are involved in any of the BTOP projects? Yeah. So open access networks, right? It's low cost and everybody can access it, and that's is less expensive and innovation friendly. And I think that's really what all of us, I think, want to see for our communications infrastructure. I like to joke that communications infrastructure, it's invisible, and if it's invisible, it's successful. Because if you don't notice that you're communicating, if you don't get a little dial-y thing going when you're communicating, that's a good thing, right? You don't want to see it. When you see it is when it's too slow, or it's not working well, or it's not there, right? That's when you notice communications infrastructure. So if it's invisible, that's good. The other thing that's good is if it's open to innovation. So anyone can come in and build some app over the network, right? And that's I think been really, really critical. If you look at, it's sometimes harder to see historically, but it really has been there from day one, at least in the public switch phone network, or what's called the PSTN. How many of you went to the PSTN to IP transition yesterday? Anyone go to that? Yeah. Okay, so this is what we're talking about, okay? In the PSTN, it was a common carrier, right? Okay, so people who wanted to build an alarm system on top of it, or a life alert system or things like that, they could do that, right? In IP, same deal, right? The internet, I want to build an alarm over the internet, I can do that. I want to build a thermostat that uses the internet to tell me, I can set my thermostat from the office, thermostat at home from the office. I can do that, right? It's all open to applications on top of it. What's our future mobile network going to look like? What's our future wireless network going to look like? Is it going to look like that? Or is it going to be that the alarm system has to be a piece of my mobile package that I buy from my mobile network operator? Am I going to be able to use an app from somebody else to do it? That's the kind of thing that I think we worry about, is keeping the infrastructure innovation friendly. And ultimately, that is what the open internet proceeding is about. It's saying, as we move to the internet as a commercial platform, not just a cute little academic exercise, what are the commercial terms in which innovators can get access to it?
On the topic of wireless, let me actually move over to TV white spaces,
Okay.
which Sharon had mentioned. And Google and Microsoft are actually two leading and very influential advocates for this new technology opportunity, which is a huge opportunity for local governments for new broadband facilities in partnership with the private sector, or otherwise using, as Sharon said, the unused television frequency, which is quite tremendous from the standpoint of propagation and enabling new broadband capabilities. So I'm interested to hear from all three of you, your thoughts on that technology and its potential in particular for local government deployers and users.
Okay.
Jump in.
I'm just in a very personal level, I'm very thrilled about the white space technology because as Ed said in his speech, using the low frequencies, TV is in the prime beachfront spectrum, it's in the very low frequencies that go longer distances for the same power levels, and through sometimes more important, through rocks. And I live in New England, where the hard to serve areas, it's like Appalachia. I mean, it is Appalachia. It's the Appalachian Mountains going up to the north, right? And there are significant unserved areas in New England. People don't think of that because they think of New England as being very urban, but in fact, there's large rural parts of the New England states that have a lot of hills and trees. And we call them mountains, but in the rest of where he lives, they would call them hills. Right? So the white space has this glorious property that it's using the low frequency spectrum, and you can actually get through the hills for a lot less cost than you would otherwise. So I'm actually excited that there's finally a wireless technology that might work where I live. So I think that's great. Another place that's actually doing a project like this is Garrett County, Maryland, which actually Joanne's firm's been involved with. It is a very, very beautiful part of Maryland. Again, you think of Maryland, you think of urban, but there's plenty of rural parts of Maryland, as I discovered living there for 3 years. Garrett County is the home of Deep Creek, which is a very beautiful place. I happened to move to Washington the year of the Snowmageddon, and so we found a wonderful place to ski there. But it gives you a flavor of what the place is like. It's pretty remote. mountainous, sparsely populated, and stunningly beautiful. And they got $250,000 grant from the Appalachian Regional Commission, which they've matched 1-to-1. And they're going to be building a TV white space network over the next 8 months, trying to reach 800 homes. It's a county-owned and partially, as I say, funded network. And they will be working in partnership with some kind of ISP or ISPs, I suppose, to bring internet service to people. So it's definitely a role for the local government there to be the one who owns and operates this, or owns at least the white space network. And again, why is that possible? That's possible because the One Maryland, I'm looking at Lori, the One Maryland broadband network goes out to that area and connects with fiber and provides inexpensive backhaul to this project. So a lot of things come together. I think one of the when we talk about technology and the economy, it's important not to lose sight of the fact that it's rarely is it any one thing. It's a bunch of things happening at once. And we're seeing the mobile broadband, we're seeing the wireless, not just mobile, but wireless. We're also seeing some other technologies, but you can ask me another question because I want to let other people talk. So.
Well, I mean, just tying the couple of the different threads together, I mean, one of the things that's so exciting about white spaces is the idea that you can have unlicensed usage. Because like the open internet, that's an environment of innovation without permission, where, of course, we know there are going to be certain use cases, but what's most exciting is the use cases we probably haven't thought about yet, haven't conceived of, right? People didn't know of or didn't conceive of Wi-Fi per se when that part of the spectrum was made unlicensed. And now, again, the benefits from it, the economic as well as other benefits, are astounding. I think, proving out that case is part of what white spaces can do. And that's something that people have heard from the Microsofts and the Googles and the think tanks of the world. But as Sharon said, I think more and more they need to hear it from others like yourselves, that this is really a crucial piece of our innovation policy.
Did I say that TV white spaces are unlicensed? I think I may have forgotten to say that. It's so obvious that I forgot to say it. TV white space, you get to use it in an unlicensed way. And in fact, again, it's a technology-enabled thing. You use a database to figure out which TV frequencies are available in your area to do this. The other thing that I think is really cool about TV white space is it's sort of a first-generation idea. The next generation is one in which it's not just that spectrum, but there may be other spectrum that's not in use at any given moment. And you may be able to tell that in a dynamic way and get what's called dynamic spectrum access, of dynamically searching for spectrum that's available and using it. And that has, again, as Derek says, these are things that economists find very challenging to measure, but common sense tells you has to have enormous benefits because there's stuff out there, it's valuable, it's not being used at a moment, and the technology is fast and quick enough and smart enough to say, not being used, let me grab it, let me use it, let me get that cell phone call through. In a public safety, in a disaster scenario, that's got to be hugely valuable. Things are very congested, but here's a moment I can get the call through that, to my kid, I'm okay, are you? That has huge value. So we see TV white space also as kind of a first step along the way to dynamic spectrum, which is another. I think it's going to be a while, but I think the technologies are all in place today to do these kinds of things, and I think it's very exciting.
And the TV white space opportunity is one that we are seeing local governments and libraries and other kind of public institutions all over the country jump on, in part because it's unlicensed, so it's low barrier to entry, relatively cost effective, and it's a distribution mechanism for content by local governments and for enabling internet and making things available in ways that the old Wi-Fi spectrum did not enable. Angie, I think you had...
I was just going to add that with respect to that, having the diverse networks in your communities is just so important. We've seen the impact that Wi-Fi had, and wireless users tend to want to get to wireline as quickly as possible, but having the different capabilities on the wireless by having the Wi-Fi, now the white spaces when that gets up and operational, that's a really exciting opportunity both for residential consumers, but also for small business consumers and entrepreneurs. And it is hard to measure, as Sharon said, but I think what we can all observe in our own lives, how much our lives have changed and how we interact with the networks in the last 10 years. When I was working on the Open Internet Order on behalf of Commissioner Clyburn, I didn't have a smartphone. I still had a flip phone, and I was made a little fun of at the commission because I still had a flip phone, but I did have to switch to a smartphone when my flip phone died. And it's amazing what it's done to change my life and how much easier I can manage my life. And so this times 10, 100 times greater when you think about folks, what they're trying to conduct. They're trying to conduct their business and create economic opportunities in your local communities. I mean, that is just, it's exciting to see it, and it's also just really thrilling to be involved in the policy making in Washington, to have these ongoing discussions about the benefits of it. But it is so crucial. I'm going to put on my old FCC hat for just a moment. It is so crucial for the agency to be hearing from you all about what you think it's going to do for your communities, because without those voices, it does tend that it's very easy for inside the Beltway for it to just be the companies and that have the most interest and the trade associations to be talking. But when you hear from the citizens, when you hear from the local communities and the leaders in the local communities, it really can help the commissioners and the staff, understand and forge a way that's going to be more beneficial for you all.
Thanks. I'd love to get some questions from the floor. There are microphones set up here and here. Please come to the microphone if you have any questions. And Jerry, will you go to the microphone? You're second in line.
Nick Miller, and this is actually a question for Angie, but I'd ask the other panelists to comment on it. Your comment on the net neutrality argument was intriguing. In a world of information services traveling over information networks that are largely unregulated, what's the future of the competitive of CompTel and its membership?
Well, we're definitely in the mix of it. They are providing a lot of information services, but what's important to our members is that they continue to have the kind of connectivity that they have today, and that requires interconnection with other networks. We still have great concerns that there are a few big players that have market power. And when you sit down to negotiate with them what the interconnection agreement is going to look like, they can make lots of demands. And so we think it's important that governments still provide a regulatory backstop to help level the playing field so that the interconnection opportunities, one, are still there, and that they're fair and that they're reasonable. Because if competitors are paying a lot of money for those interconnection rights, and that's going into the coffers of the big companies, they're not going to be able to pass along the kinds of savings that hopefully they could pass along if the current regime, which is a regulatory regime which ensured that they had interconnection rights on just and reasonable basis. And we've been focusing on the voice, the managed voice product. Most of the voice traffic in the United States is still managed voice traffic when it's VoIP. There is some over the top, but that's actually a much smaller percentage. So when we are talking to the FCC about what our request is, that the provisions of the Act that apply to interconnection, that it apply to the managed VoIP product of Comcast, of Verizon, of AT&T, that's really what we're discussing with them. And it's an issue that the Commission is looking at as it's considering the transition of the PSTN from TDM over to IP. And many of our providers have actually been at the forefront of introducing IP. When they're building their networks, they've been using IP. And then what they've been doing is transferring the traffic into TDM in order to interconnect. And what they'd like to do is to be able to just send their traffic to the ILECs in IP. And I've been told, I'm not an engineer, but I've been told that there is a loss of benefits whenever you're translating that traffic over into TDM. So as more of the networks are relying upon IP, having them interconnect in IP is going to pass along benefits to consumers, and new services and voice applications can be offered to consumers, which would be a good thing. So we will continue to be in the mix here and really put forward our ideas about how to go about handling the transition issues so that consumers continue to have the choice that Congress thought was really important back in 1996 that we think should continue.
Jerry Litter, and I want to thank you for over the years for how great you always were in that office. I think every wireline advisor should have to have a spouse that's a local government planner. You used to make some of our cases a little easier to make to you, right? Actually, I'd like you delved in a subject when you were talking about, we had public safety, and now we're talking about a lot of sort of competitive or entrepreneurial space in Spectrum. I think local government's being told by a lot of folks that if we really want FirstNet to be funded, we need to make sure that we don't set aside any of that spectrum for wireless uses or for unlicensed use. We need to lease it all out, because that's the only way that we can be ensured that there'll be sufficient funding for FirstNet. I was wondering if you have some suggestions on how we might respond to that, because I think local government does get it and is appreciative of having that sort of unlicensed and free or entrepreneurial space, but we also want FirstNet funded. So I think people are torn. I'd love your suggestions on how to respond to that.
I can start, and probably others have yeah. So first is, when is the next spectrum auction after what Jerry's referring to is that the next big, huge auction that's coming up, possibly in 2014, is what's called the incentive auction, which is, first we did a DTV transition, and we auctioned off the spectrum in the 700 megahertz band. Now what they're talking about is the spectrum in the 600 megahertz band. The idea would be that some of the remaining TV stations may find it more financially favorable for themselves to sell off their spectrum and deliver their content in other ways, whether over cable or sharing with some other station. Take the payout, as the government will pay them to give up their spectrum, and then take the spectrum that's freed up, move everything around. This is called repacking. If you think of the spectrum as a big wide, a set of blocks all together, you reshuffle them all, pack it down, and create a block that can then be auctioned to mobile broadband providers. And what Jerry's getting at is he's being told that, well, we actually have to make sure that that auction of that spectrum to the mobile broadband providers raises enough money for FirstNet. By the way, there's a lot of other things too claiming the money, so it's not just FirstNet. So one way to look at it is, and when is the next auction after the incentive auction? Yeah. First of all, my point being, there isn't one scheduled after the incentive auction. This is it. If you want a big block of mobile, you got to bid a lot of money. And so I think people who are worried it's not going to raise enough money for FirstNet, it's misplaced, first of all. Second of all, the other thing is that I think we have to, so let's take it as a given. It's going to raise enough money for FirstNet, okay? But the other thing is that I think auctions are a great economic allocation mechanism, but they are a tax on innovators in a sense, in that if you think about the value that's great. What would your smartphone be? Like Angie was saying, the smartphone changed her life. What would your smartphone be, or your tablet, if you didn't have Wi-Fi? Just think about that for a second. It'd be a brick, right? Right. Yeah. Okay, so Wi-Fi, when it was produced, people were like, what is this useful for? This has no value. Has huge value. The whole smartphone industry, all that value, Wi-Fi. The whole tablet industry, Wi-Fi. Okay, think about the value of that to the economy, and then compare it to a one-time auction for the Treasury and what it does. It's a ridiculous comparison. So just the way we think about this, I think, is perverse, and that we need to be thinking about the long-term benefits to the economy of all the things, all the innovations and value to your governments and to your communities that the unlicensed spectrum is going to unleash.
So thank you for that plug. Really appreciate that. I'll be sure to pass that along to Robert, that he really is the better half of our relationship.
But I'm sure she was recused if she had to deal with anything to do with Montgomery County. So.
By way of background, Angie's husband is a planner from Montgomery County, Maryland. Yeah. We're very proud of that. So let me ask you all, just to wrap up here. We've talked about a number of different things, and a number of different things moving through the FCC. And you've made some, I think, really compelling cases for why local government needs to be engaged at the FCC. It doesn't have to be in a formal or complex legal way. It can amount to just telling a story about your community and what your community needs and how the FCC can and should facilitate that in a wide range of areas. But could you each maybe sort of talk about the proceedings where you think NATOA's members should be, what should we be focused on and thinking about, and how should we be responding?
So one of the proceedings we haven't talked about yet is the E-rate proceeding, and I think perhaps that's something that you all want to think about participating in. Comments were due yesterday, but this is schools and libraries. I'm sorry.
Reply comments.
Yeah, reply comments will be due. I think it's October 16th.
NATOA filed on Monday.
Yeah, so it's it's good because this is a universal service fund that provides discounted telecom and broadband services to schools and libraries, and the commission is looking at revamping it. It's connected with the president's position on his initiative called Connect Ed, and there's lots of discussions that are going on in Washington. In fact, I've seen a whole list of various panels and presentations that people are doing to discuss how do you take this fund to make it more efficient and more effective to ensure that schools are being connected, and not just that there's one connection, but that there's multiple connections in a school and in a library to really serve the needs. And I think those needs are changing because of the Common Core standards, the need to test students on the computer, and then also just the need to use more digital learning techniques to teach students. So there's a lot of discussion going on in Washington. Any local experiences that you all have with the program, what you think needs to be fixed in the program, but then of course, what experiences you may have in terms of your experience as a parent, or interacting with the schools and the libraries yourself as a community member is a very useful thing for the commission to be hearing. And there's a lot of momentum in Washington for the E-rate proceeding to be completed sometime, I would guess, in the next 9 to 12 months. And they're building their record now. And so I urge you to interact with Joanne to look at those issues. And then, of course, I continue to impress upon people to be talking with the FCC about what the IP transition means for your communities. We have seen one scenario play out in Fire Island in New York, where that community was devastated by Superstorm Sandy, and some of the communications networks that Verizon, the copper networks that Verizon was using to provide plain old telephone service, was destroyed. And Verizon's plan to introduce a fixed wireless product they call VoiceLink was the alternative that they had. And customers, were unhappy, and through the New York PSC process, it became very apparent that this was a service that the local community wasn't happy with as a substitute. And now Verizon just announced last week that they've changed their mind. They are now going to build Fios in this community. And so it also shows, what could happen as we talk about IP transition, and if more folks are moving from wireline to wireless, exactly what does that mean, and what maybe gets left behind? What services are you relying upon now that really can only be provided over a TDM network, and having that kind of a vibrant discussion. But it also, indicates what can happen when local community is involved, when it's involved with the policymakers, the decision makers. Verizon on its own changed its mind, but there was a significant amount of pressure on Verizon to change its mind. And, it's important that the engagement with the policymakers happens, in the states too, not just in Washington. So I encourage that as well. And the states are looking at it. NARIC recently put together a paper about that included IP transition, and so it's critical for you all to be coordinating with your state representatives through the regulatory processes and through NARIC as well.
Sharon?
Oh, there we go. Okay, there we go. So I wanted to just go back on the incentive auction that we talked about. This is the voluntary release of TV spectrum. How it affects unlicensed 2 ways. The first is that there may be some repacking, and that would affect the TV white space. But there's also a proposal in the proceeding that's being discussed, which is the creation of a nationwide unlicensed ban. And that is, you know, I know I spoke a lot about rural. How many of you are from cities? Probably many more of you, right? Okay, so, you know, a nationwide unlicensed ban would be everywhere, right? And it would be great for cities. It'd be like, you know, Wi-Fi not only on steroids, but on, I don't know, what's beyond steroids? Whatever it is, it's probably illegal. Yeah. But this would be legal, right? This would be legal, and it would be like amazing. So, in any case, that's something that I urge you guys. You know, these are very technical proceedings, as Jerry said. The main thing is to let the FCC know you want to use that unlicensed spectrum. You know, you have ideas of what you could do with it, and it would help you and your communities. The other thing I would just mention is that at the same time, there's also a proceeding going on to make more unlicensed spectrum available in the 5 gigahertz band, and that's specifically, I think, targeted at Wi-Fi type of uses, which might, again, especially for those of you in the urban areas, that might be something that you're interested in. I would also just pick up on the PSTN transition to add to what Angie was saying. I think the Fire Island example tells us that we don't want to go backward, right? But I think it's unfortunate in another way, which is that I do think we want to be embracing technological diversity. I don't think we ever all have to have a copper wire to our homes necessarily. Some of us will have fiber. Some of us might have a really high-speed wireless connection. I think that's okay. I'm agnostic as to how it gets to me. It just has to be good enough, right? So I think you know, we need to be thinking about technological diversity, but making sure we're not stepping backwards. And the last thing I would just leave you with on the PSTN transition, you know, this is a transition that's happening. Some people have analogized it to the DTV transition. I don't think that's right, because no government has their finger on a switch somewhere. But if any of you remember the Y2K, do you remember that? Yeah, right. Well, Y2K had a deadline, and everybody had to go out and look at their systems and figure out if it was affected by Y2K. About 2 months ago, the Defense Department made a filing at the FCC, and they said, "Oh my God, if the switched phone network goes away, we have a ton of systems that use it, depend on it, and we'd have to migrate them all." It's like, yeah.
And the funding would have to be provided to migrate them all.
The funding would have to be provided. Well, what I'm suggesting to you guys is you probably do too, and it would be way better to figure that out now and to start working on it when you still have a little bit of leverage than to wait till the last minute when your local phone company comes to you and says, we are flicking that switch, we are going dark, your problem, right? At this point, I think if people start planning and thinking about it and thinking about how they're going to migrate those systems, whatever technology, and as I said, it could be diverse, it's probably going to be IP-based, but other than that, you know, the underlying medium, whether it's wire or wireless, is probably going to be diverse and depend on your needs and what you have and all that. But starting that planning now, I think, actually does make some sense. It gives you a little more leverage than waiting till the last minute.
So I think, I mean, all these proceedings are important. Open Internet ones, certainly among them. But I'll talk about, you know, what are things that I think you as cities, as localities can do, because I actually think ultimately those are probably going to be more important. Regardless of how the Open Internet court challenge comes out, it's not going to resolve the question of how do we get to abundant networks, where we're not talking about how do we manage scarcity and is discrimination appropriate, but instead how do we get to big, fast, open pipes. That's where cities have been leading the way, both through public-private partnerships along with on their own. And you know, I think one of the key issues there that the federal government hasn't and perhaps can't deal with, but cities can, is how do you sort of lower the barriers to entry and encourage competitive entry into the broadband market through pole attachment to utility poles. Because of the way the statute was written in 1996, before you know, the internet became popular, internet access providers aren't clearly given the right to attach to utility poles under the federal statute. Only telephone and cable companies are. That may be the case, but still cities have within their control of rights of way the ability to require that telephone companies, electric utilities, and so on provide access to poles. That's a critical issue for providers, not just Google, but anyone else who wants to enter the market for broadband. That's something that cities can address through their own ordinances.
That's an hour-and-a-half conversation in and of itself, and we're going to take you up on that one and hope you'll come back next year, and we'll talk, well, we're going to talk about it in detail before then, but there's a real opportunity. And Milo Medine from Google will be here tomorrow, and we can talk in some detail about that. would love to pick up on it and go into more detail now, but I think we're out of time. I'd like to say as one final thought in relation to all of these different things, there are a few moments in every administration that we look back on and say, wow, that was just great. But on the topic of E-rate, there was a moment 3.5 years ago when Angie and Sharon were at the FCC, when the FCC changed the E-rate rules to allow local government networks, local, state, nonprofit, tribal, et cetera, but from our perspective, the focus was on local government networks to be providers to schools and libraries who could still use E-rate. Before that, if you were a school or library being served by your local government, you couldn't get the E-rate discount. You had to go to a phone or cable company or another provider. That was a huge change and a very important thing for a lot of the people in the room, so thank you. And please. Join me in thanking our panel, and you have 10 minutes till the next session starts. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thanks.